This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rapin. Joining me this week for episode 351, 2 dollops of cream cheese on an under-toasted bagel with cucumbers, tomato, capers, and a few slices of bacon, Brian Murray.
Hello.
And Nick White.
Hey.
I'm so glad I was able to get through that intro because it is the best breakfast sandwich to date that I've been able to find. You know, I didn't even say what kind of bagel that you would eat this on. I usually go with an everything bagel, but people have told me on the internet that a plain bagel with bacon and cream cheese is the way to go. So I think I'm going to have to try it sometime soon. But that's not what we're here to talk about today.
No, let's talk about breakfast some more.
Okay, I mean, I'll gladly...
Let's crowdsource this to Reddit, because I'm sure there are opinions.
Listen, I don't take opinions from people on Reddit, period. I only take opinions from people on TikTok, because those are the real ones. Those are the real folks out there. No, absolutely. Let's ignore that. Breakfast is great. We'll have a secret Patreon show in the near future called I Read Breakfast, and you just talk about the breakfast that you had that day. But for now, we're here to talk about comic books. So I've got 2 legally mandated questions that I need to ask you, and that is, how have you been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Nick.
I mean, it would be a mistake if I didn't begin with a West Michigan weather watch, because it is well and truly deserved. We were under a winter storm warning from Wednesday evening through Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't quite have the situation that Buffalo, New York did, which is now, under...
Just gone.
Yeah. It cannot be seen from space.
Finally.
Oh, but it's been a good weekend to stay inside, as it's been real blustery and pretty snowy. So just another good excuse to read some comics, which I did. One of those books I read was Star Wars Hidden Empire #1. This is written by Charles Soule, art by Stephen Cummings, inked by Victor Olazaba, colors by Guru EFX, letters by Travis Lenham. This follows Crimson Dawn and the previous sort of mini event called Crimson Reign, which was, again, as I think I've mentioned before, basically Charles Soule attempting to wrest some small amount of relevance from the movie Solo and be like, hey, maybe we can extrapolate like 3 or 4 things from this that are semi-viable and not just try to like shove the movie in the closet and padlock it in and try to keep it from everyone. Sorry, Ron Howard, except you shouldn't have directed that movie. That was anyway. So basically the whole point of that first arc was like, oh, Crimson Dawn, they're this new crime syndicate, but they're different, and they've infiltrated all the organizations, and they've got all these secret agents, in the Empire, in the Rebellion, in Black Sun. They're everywhere, and they could be, activated at any point, and they're truly gonna upset the paradigm, right? And of course it's like, joke's on you, I've seen Return of the Jedi, you can't fool me, like I know what's going to happen. And they're like, Charles Soule's like, yeah, but maybe. And I'm like, yeah, okay, you need to talk to the people who own the Star Wars Bible, because no one's convinced. All right.
See, here's the thing though, isn't Charles Soule on the team of rewriting the Star Wars Bible right now?
I don't know. I
think he was at one point when they were talking about High Republic stuff. They were talking about creating a whole new continuity, and that's why everything got shoved into Legends. I don't know. So maybe you should check yourself before you wreck yourself. That's all I'm saying, Nick.
Oh boy, here we go. Star Wars Canon Showdown. Nobody asked for it. It's going to happen today. It's deep cuts abound. But
finally,
yeah. But with Hidden Empire, it's like, okay, maybe we lied. Maybe Crimson Dawn really isn't going to do it, and this is about their downfall. And I'm like, okay, I mean, we all sort of figured out that was going to happen, but whatever. It's an interesting book. I think honestly, it's a much more taut, direct read than Crimson Reign was. Mm-hmm. It's not trying to float 3 or 4 subplots. It's really just sort of this mind games back and forth between Kira, who some of you might remember is Emilia Clarke's character from Solo. I don't blame you if most of you came away from Solo retaining nobody's name except you're like, hey, Woody Harrelson was in a Star Wars movie. That was weird. That happened. That was really odd. Remember when his on-screen wife was in the movie for like 4 minutes, and that was super not cool. But basically, it's this mind game between Kira and the Emperor, because she's basically declared this war. And I totally forgot that the Emperor's first name is Sheev.
Right.
Which is
good old Sheevan.
Oh,
yeah,
God.
Sheevan
Why?
Palpatine.
Who? So dumb. I hate that so much.
Revealed in the Tarkin book.
Right.
Uh-huh.
And it's like, sometimes you don't need every detail. And like, I feel like for such a long time, Star Wars was really good at being like, some things maybe are just a mystery, and maybe we don't need to know every waking moment of Yoda's life. But now they're like, you know what? The Emperor needs a first name. It's like, no.
That's like 800 years of content we can mine out of Yoda.
Yeah. They're like, and maybe we'll do a mini-series after this where we learn the origins of the Emperor's first name. And it's like, no, we don't need that. I enjoyed it. We all know what's going to happen because it's Star Wars, but yeah, I mean, it's stupid, and I loved it. Okay,
That's okay. I just wanted you to come to a concluding thought. I thought you were genuinely going to end it at yeah, and I was going to have to move on to Brian really abruptly.
I mean, it's a Star Wars book. Most of them you could end with like, yeah, I read it. I'm going to read the next one.
Directed by George Lucas.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that sounds bad. So let's move on. Nick, it's okay. We're going to move on. Brian, how are you? How have comic books been? All that stuff.
I'm good. It's tough for me to say how comic books have been because I've been playing so many video games, which I know is not what we're here for, but we got a new Pokemon. We got a new God of War. I'm finally playing Cyberpunk 2077. I am spoiled for choice over here.
Those are all games that you could easily sink 40 plus hours into as well, right?
And have for 2 out of the 3.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's great.
I haven't gotten there on Pokemon yet because it came out on Friday and I had to sleep at some point.
Right.
But I did manage to squeeze in a little bit of reading. I read Volume 2 of Deadpool Samurai. This is the Shonen Jump collaboration with Marvel to create a Deadpool manga. Story by Sanshiro Kasama with art by Hikaru Uesugi. And it's just bonkers. It's a fun, good time. There's no like story to take away necessarily. I mean, there is a story. Like the book has a plot. I'm not saying that, but it's just goofy fun. There were some actual good meta jokes in this one, which is a tough line to walk, but we managed to get one part where Deadpool is like being gutted and bleeding all over the place, and it's just like, man, isn't this a lot of dark ink for one page? And then isn't it going to bleed through? And on the next page is a big ink splotch.
Oh god!
With just you can see a text bubble from Deadpool. This will be a fun gimmick for paperback readers.
Oh god! It is interesting to see Disney / Marvel really get into the manga space, because it definitely seems like on the Star Wars front and on the Marvel front, and even on some of the like Kingdom Hearts, even it's been interesting to see them sort of take a real interest in manga readership, which I mean, we know Disney knows how to wring every dollar, right? So right.
We also get one remarkable panel where Deadpool has a pager that he's going to use to summon his backup, and you think it's going to be Captain Marvel, and it's All Might because this is a Shonen Jump collaboration. So we get this one great image of All Might bridle carrying Deadpool before he proceeds to beat the shit out of Thanos and then leap out of the page.
Awesome. Okay, so you've solidified the fact that I'm going to read this, right?
Yeah.
That this has to happen.
We got the classic, the moment that every isekai has, where somebody meets Truck-kun, where when Sakura Spider gets hit by a truck, just walks out into the street, and you have that panel of like the giant truck right next to the person before they get hit.
Yeah.
Then Deadpool's oh yeah, you could walk that off, right? And then she gets run over by another car in the background. It's
I just searched Truck-kun on Google Images. it's, it's perfect. Sorry, I just wanted to see if this panel was somewhere, but instead I was blessed with many other goofy panels featuring this idea. I love it.
And the capper for me was in the big final fight. We have a Deadpool getting jumped by a bunch of villains, and it does this weird thing where it's like the pages are all upside down for a little while, which was tough to manage on an e-reader, by the way, because it kept just reorienting itself. And then when that is over, we have Deadpool like lying on his side in the Yamcha crater, like that classic image that has been memed all over the place.
Awesome.
It's just like this book is so fun.
I'm glad that it's continued to be good, because I know when you talked about the first volume, I was like, this sounds like fun, but can a gag manga like this really survive? Like, is Deadpool just too ruined in my brain for it to be fun? And I imagine the same for you. Is Deadpool just too ruined in your brain? But it sounds to me like it's actually working, and it's playing on playing with the tropes of manga, and it's working really well.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if there's going to be a third volume after this. The way this one ended seemed like it could easily be just a stopping point for the series, which I don't think would be a bad thing necessarily. Like, I mean, sure. I'm sure that this team has done great work. I'm sure they could continue to do great work, but at the same time, like it could just be done, and I'd be satisfied with that.
Yeah, well, I definitely look forward to grabbing this from either my library, or I'll pick up a damn physical copy if I have to, or it's pretty cheap on Comixology, so I'll probably just do that. But that's cool, or Amazon, I should say. I can't say Comixology anymore, I guess, but that's cool.
What about you, Mike?
For me, I've also been deep in the Pokemon realm, so I fell off. I've also been playing Vampire Survivor like a lot recently, which if you haven't played that game, it's like turn off your brain, use your WASD keys, and just move around. And so I've just been blasting through my like backlog of podcasts, just to, I don't know, turn my brain off and just feel like I'm doing something not productive for a change. It's been wild. Plus, I also got my COVID booster on Friday, which knocked me out most of Friday night and a large chunk of yesterday. I like woke back up as a regular person right before our hangout, so that was really fun. But yeah, so I've been kind of all over the place. I read the first issue of the Hellraiser Masterworks volume that Paul recommended to me last week on the show, and some of the folks at the hangout also recommended to me, and I have to say, it's actually good comic books. So there's like light at the end of this Hellraiser tunnel for me. So I think I'm going to dive through all of that very soon. But as for other books that I read, I did read A.X.E. Judgment Day Omega and A.X.E. Judgment Day number 6. Or excuse me, Judgment Day number 6. This is the Kieran Gillen wrap up to the entire Judgment Day story arc. I don't really have much to say. It's pretty good. The only thing that's frustrating me about that event is the fact that Marvel is collecting it in the dumbest way possible, in that they're collecting the main storyline into one trade, and then they're collecting all the one-shots, which are crucial to be read in specific order as the series is coming out, in a separate trade called the Companion Book.
Why?
I don't know. I think Marvel hates their readers, but then again, we knew this already. I'm frustrated by that. I'm probably just going to wait for the hardcover to come out, where they'll probably finally release a version that has all of the issues in their order that they're supposed to be read in.
Yeah, for $60 fucking.
Yeah, it's going to be $60, whatever. I just like... I know Danny said this, I think, last night at our hangout, like he's excited for Marvel Unlimited to come out with a reading order list where you can actually read them in order in the Marvel Unlimited app, which is great for Marvel Unlimited readers. But for someone like me who maybe actually wants to own this thing, like there's no point in me buying the trades, because I don't want to have to give this to someone and say, hey, read this. But then after you finish issue 2, go read the second issue in this thing, and then come back and then read the fourth, and then go back and read the third issue in the original. Like, there's no point. It's stupid. I'd rather just burn my money. Anyways, the book that I do want to talk about is Kroma number 1. This was my pick last week on the show, and I'm so glad that I picked it. This is Lorenzo Di Felici. The brief summary of this book is: an evil monster lives in a tower released once a year to remind the people of this cordoned off city, who represents the final humans that exist on planet Earth, to remind them of the evils of the outside world. And Zet, a young, he's like a religious like army person in training as a little boy discovers that there's more to this monster and there's more to the world that he ever could imagine. I don't want to actually go any further in explaining the book because DeFelice does something really, really interesting and smart that only I think comics can do really well. And it's a very much a meta commentary in terms of like what the twist is, or meta like idea in terms of what the twist is, but I found it to be so compelling. So if you want a really cool book, you can trade weight this, and I think that's fine because it's a 5-issue miniseries, but I really think that just checking out the first issue is totally worth your money. Now it is like $8 because it is 60 pages. So if you want to wait, I don't blame you. But if you can get this on like Hoopla, or you want to wait till it's discounted, I'm going to completely ignore you, Nick. If you want to wait till this is discounted or something, I think that's fine. But really, I think this series is going to be super fun. And I feel like the artwork is just spectacular. Like that alone is worth the price as far as I'm concerned. But I really, really like this book. I thought it was a total like shocker at how cool it was. So highly recommend that if you're interested. But
I'll check it out. But if it turns out that the real monster is man, I'm going to be so pissed.
No. Well, no. The one thing this is one of those books that I'll say is I'll give you a Mike Rapin guarantee on this. It's if you don't like it, it's your money back. I'll PayPal you whatever I have to. That goes for all you listeners out there, and you can't just lie. You have to give me an honest ruling on this. But you know what? No one's taken advantage of me yet, so no one's ever going to take advantage of me. Nick, what about you? What else have you been reading?
All right. Following that little show of bravado, wow. There's just a little hubris there that we might need to revisit at some point. I don't know. There might be more people checking out the Mike Rapin guarantee this week than anticipated.
Listen, there's only like a dozen or so books on that list, and quite honestly, they're all bangers. And so if someone says they don't like them, they're lying. Okay.
Quite honestly, they're all bangers. Mike's pull quote for his personal recommendations. What an impartial response.
Yep.
Mike's gonna pay out in crypto, everyone, so just be prepared.
Yeah. I have a deep rooted investment in FTX, so I really need this to work out.
Mike's like, I need to unload this. Yeah, so what else did I read? I did read Kaya #2. This is written and drawn by Wes Craig, colors by Jason Wardy, letters by And World Design, and design and production by Erica Shantz. Honestly, I think this is one of those situations where the first issue was a really good showcase of Wes Craig's artistry, but it was definitely sort of the foundational issue problems where it was trying to do a whole bunch of world building and maybe trying to do a little too much world building, especially for a book that I think is arguably maybe not targeting younger readers, but it's younger reader friendly. And so I think having a book that can sort of I'm sure there are some 7 or 8 year olds that are like, I really want the lore, right? But
yeah, we said before we were recording, like my nephew is totally into creepypastas. He loves lore. So he's definitely the ideal reader for this book,
right? But I think the second issue, after that foundation was set, I think the second issue is much more honed in. It feels much more interested in showing instead of telling. Most of the issue is focused around this situation where Kaya is going on this hunt for this boar that they've been chasing, and you sort of get a lot more conversational elements and interplay between the characters. And of course, artistically, it's a stellar looking issue, just as good looking as the first issue. Jason Wardy's colors are sort of the unsung hero of this book. If you aren't familiar with Wardy, Wardy recently colored Wasted Space at Vault. He also colored Abbott at Boom, but I think only the first volume of Abbott. I don't think he colored the second. But it's a very bright color palette. It's a very wide-ranging color palette. Just a super, super colorful book. Really enjoyed it. For anyone out there who hasn't tried reading the series, I'd recommend it. For those of you who read the first issue and maybe felt narratively it was just a little, like I said, just a very foundational issue, I think you should try the second, because I think you'll like it more. And then I will briefly cover a small segment. It's small because I don't want to give it too much oxygen. It's called the Mike Was Right segment. It shows up ever so occasionally. So, Zander, you can throw in the Mike Was Right jingle right here.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I am wrong, the world makes a little less sense.
Why you pulling me? I'm right.
Say my name.
You're Mike Rapin.
You're goddamn right.
Sometime I'm right.
In this week's Mike Was Right, you might recall a while ago, Mike said, Homesick pilots starts as one thing, turns into something else, and if you showed up for the first thing, you might get a little disappointed. Having read 1 through 8, I can tell you, again, name of the segment, Mike was right. I read 1 through 8. I suffered through that second arc.
Mm-hmm.
My God. Look, it's a very beautiful book. Casper Wingard, I'm sure I'm butchering that, on art. Very beautiful looking art. I think he sort of has a different version of the Dave Stewart problem. If Dave Stewart is version of Photoshop is stuck on gray, black, and red, I think Casper has been stuck with purple and pink, and he's not been able to unlock the rest of the color palette, which is kind of jarring because the book has the colors of an 80s book, but it takes place in 94. So that's just, it looks like Miami Vice, but it clearly is supposed to be Nirvana grunge. Like everybody's got the flannels tied up around their waist, and it looks like a Nirvana album cover. Yeah, it's a beautiful book. It looks like it's supposed to be about ghosts in a haunted house, and I think for a lot of people, myself included, that's kind of appealing. The haunted house thing is kind of great. It has a little bit of a Winchester house thing going on where parts of the house are constantly moving or changing, or doorways are shifting at different angles. People are falling into the floor, which is then building around them. Yeah, it starts out as a couple bandmates are investigating a haunted house, and it turns into a book about how the U.S. military attempts to weaponize ghost trauma into mechs. And some people might be thinking, that sounds kind of cool, and it's not.
Well, let me just say one thing. So I brought this up recently at the Hangout, and someone said, well, that's how they pitched the book. And if you read the first 4 issues of this series, despite the pitch, you would not think this book was going to be about mechs. And then it becomes about mechs. It's really weird. And you know what? I don't dislike a mecha comic. In fact, I like reading Gundam when I can get my hands on it. This does not feel like a Gundam book. And that's the thing that kind of peeved me. So yeah, thank you for that in heavy quotes review, Nick.
I mean, yeah, it's ooh, let's go ahead, check out this haunted house. And then it turns into a book of let's build Jaegers with generational trauma as batteries. That's a really different thing.
I mean, Nick, you've sold me on this book. I don't know about anybody else, but I'm actually more interested now than I was.
Oh, no.
Well, Nick, Brian, I think you should take that, run with it, read it, and let us know if you, going in with the actual knowledge of what the series is about, tell us what you think. I'd be curious to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I did get the first volume for Christmas last year and haven't read it yet. So.
There we go. Well, I guess let me talk about one more book before we move on to top of our pile. For me, I also read Barbaric Volume 2, number 2 and 3. If you haven't read Barbaric before, Vault is doing this thing, Michael Marizzi, with pencils and inks by Nathan C. Gooden and Richard Pace, with colors by Addison Duke, letters by Jim Campbell. The story is 3-issue arcs about this character named Owen. He's a barbarian who can't die, who's been cursed to basically kill every evildoer he comes across with this talking axe of his that loves to get drunk on blood. It's kind of a fun idea. The first arc was heralded as one of the best fantasy comics of 2020 or 2021. I can't remember when it came out. I remember putting it off and then eventually reading it and finding it to be really fun, because I think Michael Marizzi really gets the dumbness of sword and sorcery and then just plays on into a really brutal short style comic. 3-issue arcs I think are really hard to accomplish well, and I think he's done a very good job of making that work. So this new volume continues the story, adds a little bit more depth to the character of Owen, this barbarian. His axes continued to be this alcoholic style character who constantly wants to drink blood, so that he constantly wants to find enemies that he can drink the blood of, as Owen smashes into them with the axe. This volume follows Owen and a sorcerer named Soren, who we met in the previous arc. They meet up with his friend Steel to go take out an old foe who has risen from the outskirts of Forever, this ancient demigod orc who Owen has beef with and his friend Steel has beef with. As the story continues, we get a little bit more history about Owen and who he was before he had the axe, as Steel is one of his old barbarian friends. It turns out they used to be a trio, and there's a lot to unpack in that story. So we get some cool flashbacks of those characters kind of just being barbarians, which is fun. And but the thing that really sells me about this book is not necessarily the sword and sorcery elements, not the goofy moments that we get with the axe, who's kind of like this blunt, in your face, no bullshit type character who can see through magic, and it adds a fun little layer to the story. But it's really Gooden and Duke's art. The art style in this book is insane. There's this combined like wild mix of highly detailed and slightly over processed styling that gives this book a really unique and super cool look. Like crispness and blur are used in a smart way to create a lot of depth of focus that I don't think you see done very well in other comics. I think there are some creators like Salvador LaRocca, for instance, who'll do like a blur effect to try to create a depth of field in your comic, and it looks really bad. This book, I think, does that, and it actually looks really good. I will say I don't think that the art style is going to be for everybody, because it's kind of super, like I said, over processed. And I think some people may see that and think, oh, that looks kind of amateurish, but I think that it's done stylistically in a way that makes the book really fun to look at in a lot of ways, and adds detail where it needs to be, and then gets rid of the detail where you shouldn't really be looking. So I think that's like a smart way to draw the reader's eye. Plus, the color palette of this book is bonkers, right? Like bright oranges and reds and deep blacks pair against like a deep and rich green and yellow in different places. They really establish a style of who the good guys are and who the bad guys are using that. And it's not necessarily something like a Space Riders, like an Alexis Zurit, who has these bright neon colors paired against like a void black. Instead, everything is like a muted, highlighted color, but also very dark at the same time. It feels like looking at old drawings on like parchment paper in some ways. I think specifically like the axe is done in a color that is especially different from the base color palette for everything else, to make it stand out more, but not so much that it's like this big bright red thing on the page. Instead, it's like an off-color beige that doesn't sit with the palette, but it works because it looks like bone. It's really, really well done. And I think if you flip through the pages of this, you'd be blown away by just the colors and some of the action. And then it turns out that the story is actually pretty good, and it's pretty funny. So if you're looking for some sword and sorcery that's not Conan the Barbarian, this book really hits the nail on the head. I think the second volume for this is going to be collected pretty soon, especially since issue 3 came out pretty recently. Yeah, totally recommend this book if you want some of that. If you need some more action fantasy in your life, this book rules.
So were axes like the intentional unifying theme for your reading this week, Mike, or was that just...
That's completely a coincidence.
Okay. Just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I don't like that joke. Let's move on. Let's talk about comics that are on the top of our pile, because it took me a half second. It took the gears in my head a second to click. But let's talk about comics that are on the top of our pile, either comics that are old or new, or things that you just want to get off your shelf and finally read. Brian, what's on the top of your pile this week?
Top of my pile right now is Way of the Househusband Volume 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read Volume 1 in preparation for today's episode, which you'll hear more about after the break. But suffice to say, I liked it enough that I immediately bought Volume 2. So,
hell yeah. Hell yeah.
That's definitely like the most glowing recommendation I can give. That, like, I spent money on this instantly. I didn't think about it. I just did it.
Mm-hmm. The best part about that, Brian, is let me check my shelf. There's 8 volumes out that are in total, so you've got plenty of fun times ahead of you.
That's an afternoon of reading for me.
Shit. Well, Nick, we got to start working on the next thing that we got to get Brian.
Got to find another one. Yeah,
that's very, very exciting.
Get my fix, man. I'm getting the itch.
Well, we'll talk more about that after the break. So I guess, Nick, what's on the top of your pile?
Yeah, it's Alien number 3. I'm just gonna be blunt. It's like I could say, well, it was up to something else, but I'm not interested in Star Wars Revelations #1. Like, they're doing a huge oversized one-shot to basically like set the direction for the next trajectory of the Star Wars books, and like whatever. So it's Alien #3 for me. Again, Philip Kennedy Johnson writing, art by Julius Oda, colors by Yen Nitro, letters by Clayton Coles. Sorry. Yeah, I've just enjoyed this arc. It's obviously very android centered and not as alien centric as the first arc, which I think I think people definitely knew what they wanted and expected with the first arc, and I feel like Johnson feels more able to sort of stretch his legs and build. This arc is much more about like android human relations and sort of like the complicated relationship between like artificial man and man, and I think that's only something that you can do once you've spent the full first volume blasting aliens in the face, and then you see who sticks around, and if it's nerds like me, then you give them the lore that they want. So
finally,
yeah, very, very pumped for this, because it was basically this, or Star Wars was like, hey, do you want a Yoda miniseries? I'm like, no. No.
And millions of Star Wars fans cried out yes.
Yes.
No, that's the problem.
Well, the thing is, like, I just want to say this. They're framing it exactly like they did the Obi-Wan one, right? So if you remember the Obi-Wan arc from earlier this year that they timed with the miniseries, it was like, well, it's a frame narrative, right? It's Obi-Wan, and he's sitting in the Judgement Wastes, or wherever it is. I'm sure some Tatooine nerd is going to be mad about me getting that wrong. And he's like looking back on his diaries of like, I remember when I was on Coruscant 20 years ago, fade into that memory, right? And he does this, rinse repeat for 5 issues. And it sounds like with this Yoda miniseries, it's like Yoda on Dagobah also being like, well, I'm in a shithole right now, so let's reminisce, right? And so they're going to do that for a couple issues with that frame narrative. And like,
Nick, are you bitter about this?
Nick, am I going to read all of it? Yeah. I'm going to be mad. Yes. They're going to get my money, of course. I'm going to hate it.
If they use this as a way to like shoehorn in a name for Yoda's species, I'm going to be so mad. I love that there's just no name.
There's just no name.
It's just Yoda's guys. Like,
I miss when Star Wars was like that. Like, Star Trek was like, we are going to dissect every single detail of everything. And Star Wars is like, yeah, he doesn't have a last name. Who cares? We'll talk to George at some point. Maybe he'll come up with something.
Could you imagine if his last name is just like Johnson? Like Yoda Johnson? Before I get into my pick for this week, I should shout out some of the folks that are listening live on Discord with us. Danny is going to be reading Once Upon a Time at the End of the World #1 from Boom Studios. Paul G is going to be rereading Morning Glories. And Jeff is going to be reading Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts, which is very exciting. I thought he was going to be reading The Wake, which is a totally different book. Oh, and Hannah is getting in at the last second with Day Tripper. So good for all of you. I'm glad you're all reading pretty good books. It sounds like everything's going to be good. But for me, I had plenty of books that I could have read this week. Plenty of winners that are coming out. Department of Truth #22, The Human Target #9, 8 Billion Genies #6, X-Men #17. But I'm picking a book off my shelf because you've heard me exclaim how much I love all those other books. So let's talk about a book that you maybe haven't heard of that Nick turned me on to. This is Joyama Book 1 by Daniel Isles. Nick showed this to me a while back. The art looks incredible. So I snagged a copy at Barnes & Noble a while back when I went on a I'm going crazy, let's just buy a bunch of manga day. And this looks really cool. It looks like Akira meets Mega City 1, very cyberpunky, very simple black and white and gray. It's got a big anime manga vibes, but with a Western style, which I think looks really cool. The story seems to be about a government-hired hit squad hired to take out someone, and the question of who was this person intensifies a conspiracy as the story develops, and I'm always up for a good action, mystery, dystopian future thing. Let's see how this goes. The book itself looks very pretty. I'm really excited to pick it up off my shelf and read it, so very excited about this. And Nick, thank you for turning me on to this book. I appreciate it.
I haven't finished it either, so we're going to both have to read this now.
It's a race. It's a race. Well, cool. This is all sounds really good, but let's take a quick break. We're going to talk about some of our Goodreads Reading Challenge books, and we're going to jump into the topic right after the break. This week on I Read Comic Books, we're talking about our Goodreads reading challenge for 2022. Brian, Nick, and I came to this week's episode to discuss the books that we picked. We haven't done one of these episodes yet this year. The reading challenge has been all over the place. It's an incredible number of books. We did change things up a little bit, so if you're curious, check out the link in the show notes to go join the reading challenge and make sure you finish it by the end of the year so that you can become one of the people that picks the first book that we read for next year as part of the reading challenge. Some things are going to be changing with that in the future, but more on that later this year. For now, Brian, Nick, and I are here to talk about the books that we picked, why we picked them, and what we liked or disliked about the books that we picked. So I guess jumping right into things, we're going to talk about Brian's pick, which was Spider-Man's Spider Shadow. It's called Spider-Man Spider Shadow. This book was written by Chip Zdarsky with art and inks by Pascal Ferry, colors by Matt Hollingsworth, letters by VC's Joe Caramagna. The summary for this book that I kind of put together here was, in a what-if universe, Spider-Man's connection with the Venom symbiote drives him to murder some of his enemies under the guise of they would have gotten out of jail anyways. After Spider-Man becomes the menace that J. Jonah Jameson always thought he was, the Sinister Six team up to take Spider-Man out once and for all. I don't know how much of a major spoiler that is, but regardless, we're going to be talking some spoilers today, so just a fair warning. Brian, what's up with this book? Why'd you pick it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always a sucker for a good what if. And so when I saw that this was coming out, I was initially concerned because the whole it's a dark and gritty version of the character. Like that's something that has been done to death with every character in the Marvel canon.
Sure.
But I saw that Chip Zdarsky was writing this one, and I've enjoyed a lot of what Zdarsky's put out. So I gave it a shot, and I was actually very pleasantly surprised by it. I feel like it does a good job of really getting into Peter's head, and it's not just like Spider-Man is bad now. It actually examines, like, this is why Peter is feeling this way. These are the events that brought him to this point, and this is why he's continuing to act this way based on what has happened to him.
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought it was really, really well executed as far as what ifs go.
Right. And in Marvel's typical, fashion, they usually what ifs are maybe one issue at a time. And so you have to compact a lot of story and development and character choices into like a handful of panels to be like, I don't like this anymore. I guess I'll kill everybody. And like that becomes the story. So it was nice to see this stretched out. But I have a lot of thoughts about this. I'm curious, Nick, you're not a big Marvel reader. You're not a big Spider-Man reader. So What was your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, what if stories for me are already kind of terrifying because what if is kind of predicated on what's expected. Like, we're going to riff on the norm. And for me, a lot of times it's like, yeah, but like, I don't in this setup, I don't know what the control is, so I don't know why we're gonna go talk about the variable.
Sure.
That's about as much math and science as I know. That's all of it, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So there was kind of that difficulty, but thankfully I have seen Spider-Man 3, which means I think I was pretty well set up to read this book. It is true that most of my Spider-Man knowledge is permutations and combinations on the I'm a bit of a scientist myself line. I love all of the memes. I love Willem Dafoe. I love any of the stuff. Him doing the Green Goblin voice makes me laugh every time, even when it's not supposed to. So that is my collected knowledge. But I was pretty excited when the intro mentions like Spider-Man found a new black costume that responded to his every thought. And I thought about Spider-Man 3 and I was like, I mean, he was really moving in that suit, but I didn't really think that it had powers. The 3-piece suit, where he does I don't know what you call that dance suit. Yeah, exactly. He sort of like glides in the door and slides out like 2 seconds later with that suit on.
Emo Parker, yes.
History at some point will elevate that movie into the film pantheon to its rightful position, but it won't be for a while. Honestly, I think this book had a tough line to walk between, as you said, Spider-Man just murdering everyone, and then also coming from Chip Zdarsky, and it being a Spider-Man book, not turning into a weird tonal discord between Spider-Man and Chip's comedic leanings on top of also trying to do this darker story, because I think that would have been even more difficult to juggle and possibly not feasible. And I know that I think Chip's been writing Daredevil, right?
He's been writing everything
amongst other things, and I assume most of those aren't exactly a laugh fest. So clearly, like Chip has, compared to a lot of the non-Marvel stuff that I've read, it seems like Chip has sort of pivoted out of being quote, oh, the funny one, right? It seems like he's sort of.
I mean, didn't he like start his tenure at Marvel with Howard the Duck or something like that?
Right around that time, sure.
I can see why you were concerned.
It's weird because I think like us, I think unfortunately a lot of us on the show aren't necessarily reading like all the big Marvel books and all the big DC books, with the exception of maybe some Batman stuff. So it's interesting to see like these creators who we know from their comedic, offshoots, right? Like Ryan North writing Squirrel Girl or Jughead or something, and then it turns out, oh, he's writing Fantastic Four. And so when I picked up Fantastic Four #1, I was like, there's gonna be some bits in this, and it's like some maybe creators have more depth than that, Mike. And I think Zdarsky, is very good with comedy and stuff, but I also think that he has for the last year or two been leaning away from that into other stuff. I think like his Public Domain book has a lot of drama and comedy in it, whereas like his Daredevil and his Peter Parker stuff that he's done, Spider-Man stuff, has definitely shied away from that. So it's interesting to see, pick up a book like this, and I feel the same way as you, Nick, where you maybe expect a little bit more quippy Spider-Man, especially with it being Spider-Man of all characters, and instead you get this pretty dark and, in my opinion, very nuanced take on the Spider-Man and a lot of those characters that somehow manages to fit inside of this very short miniseries. So I totally understand where you're coming from with that.
Yeah, and like after it sort of establishes a darker tone, I'm just thinking to myself, oh boy, like I hope he doesn't try to like roll in the jokes now, because that's gonna be weird. That's gonna be weird.
Yeah.
But I think people that don't know a lot, or maybe only seen the movies, or just have that sort of pop culture osmosis of Spider-Man will be fine. Just as a side note, what's with all the goblins? Like, there's so many goblins. Like, what's the deal?
Goblin Nick.
All right. Hold on. Bleep that. Zander, bleep that. So that's the thing I found interesting about this, right? I think if you don't know a lot of the history of Spider-Man, this book can work for you, but also there are moments where you're like, what exactly is this, right? We know that Green Goblin has a green mask and flies around on a glider. That's the basic gist of the Green Goblin. And yet in this book, we see him dressed up as the Hobgoblin. And I think it doesn't really affect the story to know that, but it does feel out of place. You're like, is this actually Harry Osborn? Harry Osborn, or is it someone else?
No, it's a different guy.
Is it right? Exactly. So you're kind of wondering, which goblin is this? Who is the Black Cat? If you don't know Spider-Man's strange romantic history, that he's dated the Black Cat, and who is she? What does she matter to the story or anything? Compared to the MJ that we all know. It can be a little bit, I think, leave you with some questions, but it doesn't take away from the story by any means. But this book clearly takes place in a specific era of Spider-Man that Zdarsky wanted to write, and I found that it ultimately worked, right? Your basics, that there's Doc Ock, that there's a Shocker, that there's a J. Jonah Jameson. I think the Eddie Brock thing was pretty fun. If you know about Spider-Man lore, Eddie Brock,
Brock Ock,
who becomes Brock Ock, who levels up in this. I really like the way that they twisted things and made it like kind of a fun new way to approach that character. But yeah, so I don't know, but I think, like, again, if you don't have the Spider-Man lore, this book probably works. And Nick, I'm curious to know, like, do you think, like, without knowing all the ins and outs of Spider-Man, did this book work for you?
Yeah, I think obviously Spider-Man has such a history, and what a complicated tangled web has been woven over the years. So I'll just leave now. And so. But there wasn't a character that I encountered and I was like, well, who the heck is this, right? Obviously, again, with a character that's been around for so long, I think most writers, especially those who are steeped in deep to lore, are always sort of like, well, what deep cut character do I want to throw in here and just show how smart I am, right? And just flex, right?
I mean, honestly, I'm surprised there wasn't a Stiltman reference in this book, because I feel like, of all books, why not? But anyways.
Right. And that's the thing, right? There wasn't a deep cut character, at least for me. Maybe like Hobgoblin was the one where I was like, oh right, it's just Goblin Palooza in the Spider-Verse. But
there's two, right? Like,
Yeah, there's
admit
two.
that's
There's
a lot
like,
of goblins.
but how many people take up? Even I know that like the Green Goblin mantle is like a revolving door, is it not? Like it's a.
we don't have time.
No, let's do it. Let's pivot the show. But I will say this, like I really liked having the Fantastic Four. Obviously, they're both in New York, right? And obviously they've got a history, and Johnny Storm and Peter Parker are best buds, et cetera, et cetera. I do want to briefly speak about the art in this book. For me, one, I'm not really familiar with Pascal Ferry's art, so keep my, following comments in that context. But I found it really inconsistent. There was a lot of stuff I really dug, and there was a lot of stuff where I was just absolutely kind of like, this doesn't look like the rest of the book. Like the Fantastic Four stuff looks great. And almost like a lot of the Fantastic Four scenes almost have like this retro-ish, softer color palette going on that I really liked. But then like MJ was just drawn very weirdly for me. I don't know. Yeah, like almost like character to character. If you would have like put all of the people in like a lineup, I'm not so sure I would have said it was the same artist. But the action shots were great. I thought the action scenes were great. The Spider-Man side was great. When it was like Peter Parker, I felt like the art almost looked like someone else was sharing art duties. And yeah, I don't know.
Sure.
But I found it approachable and enjoyable. So, I mean...
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. I felt some of the inconsistency. Some pages looked rushed compared to others, in terms of just like the amount of detail or the amount of like, I don't know, like quote unquote sketchiness. Like, and again, these are probably not good grades. We are not perfect, art critics by any means, but you can. I feel like as a reader, you can tell when a page feels like done quickly compared to a page that's done with a lot of time at times. And maybe that's a combination of inks and colors, and who knows, maybe that was intended. But yeah, I feel what you're saying with that. I did like the inclusion of the Fantastic Four. I thought that was a fun way to like turn the story and make it not just about Peter Parker. And I love the way that the interactions between those Peter Parker and the Fantastic Four really worked, especially near the end with the symbiote and all that stuff. We don't have to necessarily go into the details to spoil it, but I do like the way that the story twisted in order to add some more depth, more than just like, oh, the Sinister Six are out to get Spider-Man now. I thought that was pretty cool. So yeah, overall, I did like this book. I thought it was pretty fun. I haven't read a Spider-Man book in a long time, and it kind of reminded me of why I liked reading Spider-Man when I did. I just fell off the train and never got back on, but who knows? Maybe that rail's going to circle back, baby. Let's keep with the metaphor. Who knows?
Go back and reread Superior Spider-Man.
Yeah. Yes. That's yeah, maybe. I've heard good things. Did you like that one, Brian?
Yeah, it was okay.
Okay. Well, I guess any final thoughts, Brian? Any last bits you want to say about this book before we move on?
No, I mean, I'm glad that it genuinely seems to be a positive reaction to it. I saw Paul in the Discord chat saying that a lack of the spider lore did make it harder to enjoy, which I totally get. Like, I think that I didn't notice that just because like I don't read a ton of Spider-Man, but he is still my favorite like Marvel character. So I think I forget that not everybody has that like back pocket of Spider-Man lore that I have.
Right. Yeah, totally get that. But yeah, let's move on and talk about Nick's pick. Nick picked The Way of the Househusband, written and drawn by Kazuki Ono. The summary I wrote for this was: Kenjiro Tsuda was the fiercest member of the Yakuza, a man who left countless underworld legends in his wake. They called him the Immortal Dragon. But one day, he walked away from it all to travel another path, the path of the Househusband. And quite honestly, you can't really sum up what this volume is, I think, without just talking about every single individual story. So I think we're going to try to avoid that. Brian, you said you loved this book enough to buy the second volume. Yeah. So let's hear your thoughts on this one.
I thought that going into it, I thought that the gimmick of like, this person used to be Yakuza and now he's a house husband. Isn't that funny? I thought that was going to get old really fast. and it doesn't at all. It is still very funny at the end of the volume.
Yes.
It's just they keep going back to a lot of the same jokes, and you'd think it would be stale, but every single time he's like doing something very domestic, and they cut to Tatsu's face, and he's just like super intense, like staring down at a knife or something. It still makes me laugh every time.
Yeah,
I don't know how they do it, but well done.
Yeah, this book is easily one of my favorite manga to recommend to people because it's such a perfect example of what a good gag manga is. And somehow I like went into this book when I first read it with no preconceived notions as to really what to expect, other than I knew it was a joke. Like, the premise is very straightforward, and somehow 8 volumes later, it's still very funny. It's maybe not as consistently funny, like perfect 10 out of 10 across the board, but it's like high 8s, high 9s, high, and 10 across the board. And I love that. So this first volume has some of the best bits that I think if it doesn't hook you here, it's never going to hook you. Moments of like lines like, where do you hide the white powder? The good stuff. Like, and he's talking about flour. Like, that is the level of goofy gag that we get in this, and it's perfect because the stories aren't long. Each chapter is like 10 to 12 pages each, and they always end with, like Brian said, the same kind of punchline, or if something does continue, it's like a very small minor thing, because as you read more and more of the volume, some of the jokes start to reference back to things that have happened in previous things, but it's like not completely necessary to have read those to get the joke. The anime of this polycure police officer thing that his wife is obsessed with is a thing that is consistent throughout the series, and the more in depth it becomes and real, the funnier it gets to me. So I love this story. I can't talk about it enough. But yeah, rather than dissecting all the individual issues, Nick, I guess we should ask you, why did you pick this for the reading challenge? What did you like so much about it that you think everyone should read it?
Yeah. So, I mean, full credit, Mike obviously recommended this to me a while ago, and I don't think it was one of the first mangas I read, but it was definitely one that was probably within the first 5 or 6 that I read. So pretty new in my manga history, if you will. And it's just it's a funny book, but also like artistically, it feels like it's super well drawn, super detailed. I would say it's like somewhere between a conventional house style, but then also sort of its own thing. And again, just like the comedy hits, and comedy is just, it's so hard to do in comics. It's just so difficult to like actually elicit a laugh, at least out of me. So when it happens, like, or when I get a smile on my face, like, I know a book is doing something right. And just the juxtaposition of the detail of the action sequences and the intensity of the art, and just how
quote unquote action sequences of Kinjiro just running through a supermarket so that he can get discounted cabbages or something.
Right. Oh yeah. I mean, but it's like, the thing is, like, yes, that's what's happening, but it's framed, like, and it's shot and it's drawn like it's like an actual action combat manga. And it's really him in a battle with all of these other people at the supermarket trying to get the deals, because he's got all of his coupons prepared, and he's, like, I'm ready to throw down or whatever. And he's like, it's coupons.
There's one great moment where he's running from these Yakuza goons who were sent to try and catch him after he crashed his bike. It's not important why. But they chase him into a store where he was going to try and get a deal. And afterwards, he is berating these two as if they were his henchmen.
Right.
And talking about, like, we got a t-shirt and a pair of gloves. That's it.
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
The jokes that constantly come up of, like, other Yakuza still thinking that he's in the Yakuza,
right,
and then trying to, like, deal with him, and then he teaches them, like, a life lesson about how to get a better discount at a grocery store if you go and bring your own bags or something. Like, it's so absurd, and every single time, like, after you read enough of this, you know what's coming, and it still works every single time, because every once in a while we get a little bit of lore, like a little bit of like tiny minuscule pieces about the history of this character, so you never know if that's going to be one of those moments. But when it turns into a joke, it hits every time, because you didn't get the lore, but instead you got that sort of thing. It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect.
Yeah, the art is just amazing. I love the sequence with the shady knife salesman who comes to like sell him those crappy knives, and he's like, I'm gonna show this guy, and he like makes him like a full lunch with the knives, and like his lunch is like so good that the guy, all of a sudden, like you see this blurry panel of like euphoric bliss as the guy like eats the hamburger, and it like makes him think back on his childhood, and it's like this fuzzy picture of him like in the park or whatever, just smiling or whatever, and it's like so goofy. Like, this isn't like a deep book, so I don't want to like pontificate on this too much, but I have this stupid I have this liberal arts degree, so I have to read into everything too much, right, to some extent.
Please.
To justify the degree. And in that regards, what I like about this book, when I think about it a little more, is that, and again, I don't know if this was the intent, right? But this is postmodern literary theory, baby. Meaning making is what you make of it. And for me, I do really appreciate that there's sort of this idea underpinning it that, like, whether you're staying at home and you're cleaning the house or buying your groceries, or whether you're out, working some job or whatever, that you can approach whatever you do with sort of like an intensity and like a devotion, and that like whatever you do, like you can master it and you can take it seriously, and that it's like just as valued as what anyone else is doing. So I do really like, for me, like that idea that like, yeah, he's out, buying all the food for the day, and he's making the dinner, and he's keeping the house clean, and he's, remembering everybody's birthdays and joining all the neighborhood organizations. And like, it's a lot for him, and it keeps him busy, and he like really loves it. And, there's a point where, his assistant addresses the elephant in the room, right? And he's like, you used to be in the Yakuza, and that was a big deal, and you were this head honcho, and like, when are you going to come back to that? Because like what you're doing right now is a joke or whatever. And his reply to him is, what was it? He says, I'm protecting my family my own way. You can't protect what's precious to you through violence. And I'm like, okay, this book is getting weirdly a little like meditative now, but I think there's something in that. And I appreciate that, because I think this book also could have been some sort of unfair jab at like, well, he used to be in the Yakuza, but now he's doing all this other dumb stuff or whatever. And it's not that.
Yeah, there's definitely like a love letter to the idea of dedicating your time to being this house husband person. I totally could see that. But also, it's pretty funny that Yakuza man has a fight with Roomba.
And loses.
He's like pointing it to a corner, and he's like, that's your turf, and you gotta protect it or whatever.
So before we go into too many other of the story, again, this volume is a delight to read. Nick, I'm so glad that you picked it, and Brian, I'm glad that you enjoyed it. The more people I think that can get into this book, the better, because it is such a pleasure to read. I think it's one of those books that, like, if you're having a rough day or a rough week and you just need something that's going to be fun and kind of dumb, this is the perfect book. And I don't know, it always cheers me up whenever I get a new volume, because it's just more of the same, but in very fun, interesting ways. And as the series goes on, cast of characters expands, the lore, the goofiness expands. It's pretty fun, but it still stays very grounded. It's still him being a house husband.
Yeah.
And there's clearly a lot of ground for them to cover in this book. So yeah. Very cool. But let's talk about the last book that we have on this list. I picked the book Aster of Pan. This is written and drawn by Merwan, a French creator. This is basically a French book that was translated over to English, published by Magnetic Press through Kickstarter, and then now it's a thing and published in different bookstores. If you got the hardcover from the Kickstarter, it's actually cut in a really interesting way. All of the corners are rounded, that like are on the open side of the book. So like it's got a really interesting shape, this book, and it's humongous too. It's pretty decent sized. I actually have like one of the dodgeballs. Like I accidentally backed this at a higher tier than I thought. So I ended up getting like all this extra stuff. And this is one of those Kickstarters where like, I was like, yeah, I'll get a physical book and I'll get like the prints, because I think the art's really cool. And they're like, cool, we unlock this and we unlock this and unlock this. And I'm like, I didn't sign up for this. I don't want any of this extra stuff. And now I have like stickers, and I literally have, hold on, I literally have. We're on camera over here. I literally have one of the balls from this book. It's insane. I don't think that they're regulation size. I think this is a bit smaller because it's a squeezy ball. But anyways, this book is awesome, and I picked it. The summary for it is, in the year 2068, Aster is an outsider living on the island nation of Pan, a war-torn wasteland where scavenging is the only way to survive. On the day of the leadership elections, Pan finds itself being forced to join the Federation of Fortuna by force. But when Junta, Pan's leader's son, who left Pan years ago, challenges Fortuna with celestial mechanics, a sacred game of dodgeball, Aster and 6 others from Pan are recruited, and the future of Pan is in their hands. I don't know if I got all the names right in that. I was going off of memory. So what did you guys think of this book?
My favorite moment of the entire book was when we discovered that celestial mechanics was dodgeball. Like, because they talk about it, and it sounds like it's going to be this grandiose thing. And the people of Pan have no fucking idea what it is.
Right.
And so we get there, and they're like, they go into this sunken court and play a game of dodgeball. Which is like, this is the highest stakes game of dodgeball I've ever seen.
Well, yeah, because the story is that they, if they have to win this game of dodgeball, otherwise this massive country is going to basically claim ownership to them, and they're forced to give a portion of their rice rations to this bigger country because, reasons, imperialism, right? And so to play this game, like the way that it's originally described, it's like it's 3 women and 4 men come together to blah, blah, blah. Like it's pitched as this big thing, and someone's like, that's just a dodgeball game, right? It's such a goofy concept. Of course, we don't even get to that until like 40 or 50 pages into this 200-page volume, which I forgot about when I was reading it. But yeah, I guess, Brian, let's start with you. Beyond the joke of it being dodgeball, I guess, what'd you think of this book overall?
Honestly,
okay.
It didn't do a whole lot for me. I think part of that was that the lettering was very small, and the pages were all very cramped. Like they put a lot of panels onto some of those pages to a point where I had to like lean in to be able to read the dialogue. And I mean, part of that is that my eyesight is garbage. So maybe that's not an issue that everybody has, but
sure.
It definitely, like, when I was hunching forward to try and make it out, I was like, all right, this is not ideal.
Gotcha.
But I mean, I did enjoy the characters. Yeah, I thought that Aster was charming in that sort of like kick-ass, vaguely feral jungle person way that she is. Her buddy, what was his name? Willis. Willis is a very good foil for her because he is very much like as much of a city boy as you can be in that kind of a world. So I thought like the interplay between those characters was very fun.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Nick, what were your thoughts on this? We did this completely out of order. I should have said why I picked this book, but let's talk about what you thought of the book, and then I'll tell you guys why I picked it.
Why you're all wrong,
dumb and stupid and wrong.
Right. Gosh, there's so much to unpack with this book, and I don't mean that in a bad way. There's just so much going on. First off, the art kind of reminds me of like Tyler and Hillary Jenkins a little.
Sure.
Again, artists don't like being compared to other artists, but I still persist to do it. So, yeah, sorry. Also, there's like an interesting kind of like texture to the art. Gosh, like the best way I could explain this, and this is what it kind of made me think of, is like if you were, I think like in like maybe 2nd or 3rd grade, and I'm sure everybody probably did this in elementary school, like I think it was an art project, maybe it was a science project, but you like made your own paper, like you sort of like, you had all the scraps or whatever, and I don't even remember how you did it, but when you were done, right, it didn't look like a piece of lined paper out of a notebook. It was sort of this multicolored kind of like textured grayish stuff, and you're like, I guess this is paper. But it almost looks like this book was drawn, I say drawn, watercolored on like a textured surface, almost like handmade paper. And it sort of gave it with that kind of like this older aged manuscript kind of feel, as sort of this like ancient story, which makes sense when you reach the end of the book and you sort of have this outer framing network where it's like, yes, and this happened a while ago or whatever. minor spoilers. So aesthetically, I thought it was interesting. Narratively, I think for me, obviously, the book takes a shift when it kind of sets itself up or pivots into being almost like a sports comic. And obviously it maintains, on top of the being a sports comic, all of the other socio-political issues about navigating the relationship between Pan and Fortuna and Ceres. I think it's called Ceres.
Yeah.
And all of that. But at least before it pivots, and I like both parts, but before it pivots, when you're sort of trying to parse together, okay, this is kind of like a post-apocalyptic world, and we know when it takes place, right? But we don't know what's happened from now to then. And so, like, if you read some of the context clues, you can figure out that it's France, and you can say, well, Nick, it was written by a French person, I think. So, of course, that makes sense. Yeah. But, like, not everybody sets their works in their, where they live. So, unfair assumption. But you see, like, tanks, and they know what tanks are, but then I think Willis sees a drone, and he doesn't know what a drone is because he like describes it as like a flying plane. So you're like, okay, they're familiar with this, but they're not familiar with that. And just trying to parse together what's happened and sort of seeing that like now they have an economy that's like based on, I think, kilowatts. So like everyone's
watts,
right. Everybody's like bargaining for electricity, and you're like, okay, this is kind of interesting. And you're like trying to figure out like where do they stand in terms of technology, and then you are introduced to Fortuna, and like Fortuna has like all of the modern technology and more, right? And they've got like they're able to have these stadiums where they can change the weather and the temperature and the elevation, and you're like, oh wow, okay, so it's not like everybody got set back to zero at some point, right? Like clearly some people, moved forward. And I mean, I enjoy those moments where you're left to kind of take all of these different disparate elements going on and kind of make a cohesive whole out of it. And this book does a really great job at leaving those little breadcrumbs and just letting you put that together. And I really enjoyed that.
See, funny enough, that's one of the things that made me the craziest in this book.
Oh, really?
Because they tell you, like, one of the first things you see is that, it's set in 2068.
Right.
And I'm just like, that is only 46 years from now.
Right.
How did we get in 46 years to jungles in France, and people have developed whole new cultures and religions? And I'm like, I will probably still be alive in this year. Like, fingers crossed. But I just think it takes a lot longer than that for society to transform in the way that it did in this book.
Right. It's one of those things where like it would almost have been better if they didn't put a date on it, so that you could just kind of, this is some possible future thing,
And it doesn't even have to be like Earth. It could have just been anywhere. Yeah. But the fact that they put a date stamp on it and have buildings with French signs
right
in there, like it sets it into a world in which it doesn't fit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, French, I feel like, okay, so here's where we're going to talk about why I
make
put this on
blanket
the list.
statements about the French. Let's do it. I know you were thinking about it.
Yes.
Let's do it.
So I like French comics for a lot of reasons, and this is one of them. I think there is, Brian, I think your point is super valid, right? There is no explanation enough to give us a justification to think that this is some sort of alternative history or alternative future from an alternative history, right? But I like that a lot of French authors and creators do this without any explanation and just kind of expect you to roll with it. I think that some readers find that annoying, but I've read plenty of French comics where they're just like, you know what? F everything that exists. We're going to take some elements from the real world and some elements from my fake world, and we're going to throw them in there, not explain anything to you. And I think that's what makes some of these books really interesting, because if you can let go of those pieces and just kind of roll with some of the familiarity, you can be left with a book that is is trying to tell a story without trying to grab onto historical context. They're just using familiar objects and things in order to ground some of the ideas so that they can talk about something else. Because otherwise, then we have to start playing with this idea of, is this a fallout of World War II or something? And like, where are the Nazis? And we don't, in like, I think a lot of French creators probably just don't want to talk about World War II, like if they're trying to do a sci-fi story. So who knows? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think like you can say, I think the point of that was to ground a lot of things. I guess that's what I'm getting at. But I put this on here because, one, I don't think that we've had a lot of French comics in our reading challenges, and so I wanted to put something in there that I have read that I thought was really good, because I personally really like this story. I think the art is absolutely beautiful. I think Merwan does a fantastic job of drawing really exciting action scenes that like draw you in, and even if there is a lot going on the page, you can tell like there's a ton of vibrant details that are being added just to make sure that you get the full context of pictures, because I think you could go the route of something like a manga where you kind of get rid of all the backgrounds just to focus on the action. And while those things work, I think adding all of the extra layers of painting and drawings and stuff in the background just makes a richer comic, like a James Stocco style, comic where you're like, holy smokes, there's so much going on in this page. But, I can get being distracted by that stuff, too, because you start to ask questions. As soon as you start pulling on threads, it's like you can't put that back together. The sweater is becoming undone.
Yeah, it's like if you tell me that the answer to the equation is 13, I will just accept that. But if you tell me that the other two numbers that get you to 13 are 2 and 4, now I'm sitting there trying to do math and figure out what you did to get there. And
yeah.
Maybe it's just me being bad at math, but I can't pull it off.
I gotcha. Well, yeah, I guess, did you guys have any other thoughts about this book? I guess before we wrap up here, I think like I love this book just because I feel like it's a fun, stupid book about it's a dodgeball comic book that is also talking about the problems with imperialism, right? And the ending is ridiculous because why would winning a dodgeball game save an entire culture? I don't know. But I guess if it's part of your religion, like, sure, like, let's not give up on the core conceit of this book and say, you know what? Everyone was saved. The end.
Yeah, I also take issue with the slogan on their statue at the end. Something to the effect of like, spirit overcomes reason or something like that. I'm just like, no, it doesn't. That's anti-vaxxer logic.
And Bryant went and sat in the corner for the rest of the day with his arms crossed. Totally pissed off.
Yeah, Nick, what were your final thoughts about this book? I guess
I liked all of it. I thought artistically it was really great, and when it did pivot into being a sports manga, I thought that the artist, say manga, I'm so used to following sports with manga instead of sports comic, right?
You're not wrong.
That I felt like this artist had the chops to follow and deliver an action-based book. But you're right, underneath it all there is sort of a narrative about how do we feel about ideas like nationalism and citizenship, and the ideas of belonging versus not belonging, and the privileges and rights we afford to people that are seen as belonging versus not belonging, but approaching all of that in a way that doesn't feel like it's like a PBS, edutainment, everybody, take notes on this, there will be a quiz afterward sort of way.
Sure.
And I appreciated that. So, and of course now I can go and flex and tell other people I've been reading French comics, and then like pull out a pipe and puff on that, and maybe wear a beret for at least half a day or something. So I mean, there are additional perks.
Nick's just going to be walking around his suburban town and just eating soup and saying, no, it's not French onion soup. Yeah. It's just soup to me. Anyway, I think this is that's a good place to wrap things up. I appreciate you guys coming together and reading these books. It's a lot of comics to cover in one episode, so I hope that everyone was able to get through those. And if you haven't checked out our reading challenge, make sure to check out the link in the show notes. We've got a seriously awesome number of books in this reading challenge. Plus, a lot of the book of the month stuff that we've been doing this year is amazing. So if you haven't gotten on that, get on that. We're very close to 1,000 members in our Goodreads group, and as soon as we hit that, I'm going to go through the list, randomly select select 5 people, and they're going to get a bunch of free IRCB merch, stickers and shirts and whatever else we can produce on our cool little shop that we've got. So make sure you're a member too, because then you can get some free stuff from us. So to wrap things up, I want to say thank you to Brian and Nick for being on this episode. Next week's show is going to be a mini-sode. We're taking the weekend off. Nick and I recorded an Ice Cream Man episode. We know that everyone out there loves those, so we had to bring it back for Volume 7. Look forward to that. You can always check us out on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. Our Discord is in the show notes. Our Goodreads is in the show notes, as I said. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/IRCB podcast to get early access to episodes, access to the IRCB Movie Club. Episode number 13 is coming out. It's going to be awesome. Brian and Paul and I talked about Blade, which is probably one of my favorite superhero movies ever. So look forward to that. Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all of our music. I want to say Zander does not forgive, but he will forget if you ask nicely. Thank you to Brian and Nick for being on this episode. Thank you to Kait for proof listening. Thank you to everyone for hanging out with us in the Discord. And if you got this far in the credits, thank you for being one of the best listeners of IRCB ever. Until next time, comics are good, and so are you.